Okay, group 5 of questions. We have 2 questions regarding consultation. So, RAD is a community-based standard. What are the best ways to ensure community input in the revision process? And the answers in the surveys related to online tools, forums, listservs, webcasts, blogs, social media. So this came out on top along with surveys and community consultations, updates, town halls, and I guess other means of communication. And also provincial and territorial council input also was mentioned by some of the people surveyed. And the other question is, who else should be consulted and what are the best ways to engage them? Examples of potentially interested groups include archivists, archives advisors, archival educators, archives creators, archives users, digital preservation specialists, software developers, and professionals in allied heritage sectors, such as librarians and curators. So who should we talk to? Users came out on top, with most of the people identifying them as people we should talk to. Allied heritage sectors came in second, and others then are listed in less numbers. So, consultation, how do we want to do that?
I guess I just wanted to report back on what I feel like was the success of how we in BC dealt with the initial sort of response. We held a roundtable where we invited audience members to attend live and participate in the discussion, and then we also had certain members of the roundtable dedicated to monitoring email and Twitter-based questions and comments. And that garnered a high level of interaction in the province, and it was a really stimulating discussion, and I think that it could be a useful model to be considered in the future as one of many.
Yeah, as a participant in that event, I agree. It was great, and it was really nice to have the fact that it was sort of webcast meant people could ask questions sort of as if they were in the room, and it could go on. And I know one of the difficulties doing this at this kind of level is sort of the idea of needing simultaneous translation and so on, if it's going to be, which gets super expensive. But if there's any way to get that kind of forum for these sort of events, I think it's pretty good, if we can.
I just wanted to comment on the element of involving users. And the way I would approach that is not so much asking archival users and researchers what they think about the new standard, but to take advantage of existing usability testing and literature on the subject in terms of user behavior, in terms of what has worked well in the past in designing, in sort of considering some of the aspects. Most users aren't really going to care what's behind the system. I remember when EAD first came out, there was a lot of websites where we're using EAD now, and you can find well, who cares what you're using? I want to find the stuff. But so that I doubt if there'll be much engagement if it was asking them what they think about what elements should be there. But in terms of actual usability testing or taking advantage of previous literature would be one way to go on that.
And also, I'd like to add to that, because what do users want too? It's always the question I'm asking is, what do users really want to see in archival description? Most of them just want information. They just want to Google a term and get information. But maybe they do want to know about the digital carrier. Maybe they do want to know that it was on CD. And I'm going, why would you ever want to know that? But they actually want to know that. So I think in terms of the digital too, specifically, I would love to see more user testing or just a survey to say, hey, you're a researcher and in archives, what do you really want to see? Because here we are saying what we need to do as a profession, but to get more of that in.
And conversely, sometimes users just don't know what they want until we give it to them.
I would just add to Tim's comment there. something that we talk about frequently in the library is just this idea of sort of persona-driven development, and the value in sort of identifying different types of users. It's something that is appearing in the literature, and there's different approaches to it. It's controversial for some people, but I think it's important to recognize that there are some users who really don't care, and then there are other users who do. And I'm thinking particularly like funded researchers, for instance, which is a large audience for our shop. Some of them actually care about the metadata and the XML and its interoperability, and I don't think we should exclude or sort of overlook that. It's not the primary user group, perhaps, but it's useful to think about, high school students as different than undergraduate students, as different than doctoral and graduate students. They have different approaches and different needs.
I think working with allied heritage institutions would also be one of the only ways that we can promote crosswalks and develop them more fully. And thinking cynically, that might also be a revenue stream for cost sharing the development.
I think we are nous sommes dans un mode culturel de collaboration. Je pense qu'on ne peut peut-être pas s'y limiter, mais il faut nécessairement inclure une plateforme collaborative avec les différents types d'acteurs avec lesquels nous collaborons. Et pas seulement pour reviser une fois, mais je pense qu'il faudrait peut-être penser à une plateforme permanente de façon à ce que, on le sait, Norm, it's a work in progress in the digital era. So we will need to have some continuous input from several kind of people who are interfering in the description in a way or another. So I think that collaboration platform should be, I don't know what, wiki, blog, whatever, who can reach the community in its various actors and in a continuous way.
Maybe as part of the governance structure, you have a user advisory group too, right? Maybe that's something to think about in some way.
But there's a component to that where, they say if you build it, they will come. But if our users can't find our records, because our content standard isn't allowing them to identify the records that they're actually looking for, they're not going to come. And so that aspect, I think, is where our users and users of archives can speak, more so than perhaps some of the technical details, because there will always be I have one of my users who's always asking me when I'm going to digitize my next set of newspaper records. And he's one of 3 people out of thousands of people that ask, but he's very ardent in asking me every week how my newspaper digitization is coming along. In that same respect, we do need to have, in the growth, development, and evolution of our standard, that we take into account that discovery component. And perhaps speaking to our library colleagues who are experts, if we think back to the days when we were building RAD, we began first with a library standard because that work had already been well established, and librarians had already done that necessary work of thinking about the discovery aspect. And so, speaking back and consulting with our library colleagues on any changes to our standard, keeping in mind that the goal is that our users should be able to find and use our records.
I would say that we can draw inspiration from what parallel communities in the cultural sector are doing, but I would want to caution against potentially wasting too much time in consulting them for the revisions that we're making. I think that Ferber and RDA can give us some great examples, for example, that we can draw from, but a lot of the problems that we have with RAD now comes from its adaptation of ISDB, and there's still in the museum and library communities often a profound misunderstanding of what it is we actually do and why we aren't just using library standards and why it's different. And I would just hate to see us waste too much time, getting into one-on-one mode, trying to explain that to see if we can get useful feedback out of the exchange. I think it's probably more valuable for us to invest that energy first into consulting the members of our community within archives and making sure we have a standard that works for us, and then finding a way so that the work that we're doing works in shared environments and that we can collaborate across the cultural heritage sector.
Great point. I think one thing I just noticed here that seems to be missing from this list, or maybe it's sort of lumped into things like media specialists, is the creators, people who create the records. I know that I have learned a tremendous amount from donors about how to describe their records, and it's not the same as saying, oh, letting them write their biographical sketch or something. It's, what did you do to create this material? Or you know, you're a film producer and I'm working with your records now. Like, what is important to be described? Or like, we are generalists and not specialists. And so talking to artists or authors or people who are, you know, creating the records, I think would be almost a place to flip this the other way, really engage. And again, it's not about sharing the standard with them and saying, what do you think about Rule 1.8 something? It's more, what are the priorities for you in terms of your content being discoverable? Like, why did you decide to donate this material? And what are you trying to achieve? Some of the very philosophical and general questions could probably help influence this list of core elements or really the whole process.
Just to follow up on that comment, I was surprised how little the respondents thought media specialists were important to consult, because that feeds into the creator aspect and the fact that lots of we struggle with media archives, and in part it's because the donors have their own industry standards. They provide their inventory lists with all kinds of content that doesn't fit into the standard. And there's lots of work happening in film production, in audio producing groups that maybe they will give us lots of information because they're the ones who are also using the records too, right? So visual researchers, they have their own associations and their own best practices. So again, yeah.
Going back to the users, I'd like to hear about folks here from the universities. I know I'm not an expert on the subject, but I know a lot of study is being made about users and their habits and how they go about to finding information. I mean, could we not also try to do some kind of survey of the literature in terms of users and their habits and their needs? There must be a lot of information on that, no?
One of the comments that I wanted to make relates specifically. I work in a strictly undergraduate situation, and increasingly one of the challenges that I face is actually finding material, even if it's described, if you bring it out to an individual and it's written in cursive. And I think that ultimately this is going to have to be addressed somehow in the descriptive process because they can't read it. So increasingly there's an expectation that you not only provide the information to them, but it somehow be modified so that they can read it in a format or an interface that they're more familiar with. So that's one of the problems. And one of the other things that increasingly at the university, there are a number of students that have learning disabilities or challenges. So they're also looking for types of materials that would more effectively address the questions that they're presenting from the records that exist. So if it's a challenge with reading it or providing it in a different format, and that is also increasingly challenging as well.
I was going to answer a different question. I'll just address the question of users. Yeah, we have studies of genealogists in reading rooms. We have the habits of historians. We know something. We know things about little pockets of user groups. And we have different models. UK National Archives has been using the idea of the profiles. What is it? The tracker, the explorer. They've come up with profiles of users. The users who never show up in the archive continues to be very mysterious to most archives. So, no, we don't know a huge amount about users, even at this stage.
Just to add to that, I'd also caution the tendency to give preference to academic scholars. I think there's a huge, as you say, there's a huge population that they're never going to make it into the academic archives, and they're accessing the materials in different ways. So I worry and I work in an academic archive, so it's kind of hypocritical for me to say this, but there's other user groups that are never going to get the priority that historians and genealogists get, and we have to think about how are those communities being served through the descriptions, and are they being served, and how do we, I don't want to say democratize, how do we open up our concepts of users, and also the hierarchy of users. I still find that there's a bias in, oh, this is an important user, oh, this person, they're never going to come back, or that concerns me.
And also, too, because we're putting everything on, well, we're not putting everything online, but things are going online now. We don't know who our users are in a lot of cases. So you almost have to pick a representative sample of as many users as possible now.
So basically, we have to build a standard which is media-specific but not media-specific, which encompasses digital and paper, and also must address the needs of most of the users out there, the predominant, but also the people in wheelchairs and learning disabilities. And okay, piece of cake. That's a summary of
more afternoon. We'll have that. Just an observation. I'm also struck by, we've talked about regular revision cycles almost all day, and there was only one person in one group that indicated that was it? Yeah. I'm surprised. Why didn't I pick that? I responded to the survey. I don't know what I was thinking, or maybe I just said, oh, this is all great or something. Because I feel like this is an area where based on the results and the analysis of the results, I really didn't have anything else to add. I mean, it's been an interesting conversation, but I think the point is, like, yes, we need consultation, and yes, we should do it with a variety of groups, but the results from the survey are not necessarily what we're talking about or what we are saying we should be doing. And good for you, Anna, for for talking about that, because it's kind of shocking, like, that it wasn't a predominant issue.
Strikes me with this one, wasn't highly answered, and there's a lot that didn't map, and I think a lot of people sort of just said, yes, we should have consultation, it's very important. Yes to that list of people that you've mentioned in the question there, and that's it, kind of. So I think, again, this would be, if we really wanted to quantify data, we'd have to give some options rather than just, I don't know how reliable that is as a...
Maybe another question. When I teach RAD, I tell my students, RAD came from a consultation of people across Canada, and it was the result of a common effort. However, I don't know if people here were there when RAD was initially developed in the late 80s and early 90s, but that type of consultation, how was it done? Was it only, because I saw there were some special events with ACA and AAQ, I think. There were some conferences, but what were the other means used to do this consultation back then? Were people there back then? Yeah?
I was there.
You're next to me. I have to hug it.
So the planning committee established working groups The working groups had a representative from the ACA, the AAQ, and National Archives of Canada. And they would draft their chapter using AACR2 and any other standards. So, for example, in addition to being the project coordinator, I was on the Textual Records Working Group. So we used archives, personal papers, and manuscripts. We looked at guidelines from all over the place and came up with a draft chapter. The planning committee would then critique it. It would go through a revision process, and then it was sent out to the community for comment for 3 months. After 3 months, the responses would come back, and they would be sent. Every member of ACA and AAQ received a copy. All of the provincial territorial councils received a copy, National Archives. When the comments came back, we prepared a compendium of comments and organized what everybody had to say about 1.1B4B, 1.1B4B1. And the planning committee would meet with the working group, and they would discuss the comments that were made. Some of the comments were taken on board. Some were seen as being dissonant with the overall aims of the standard, and so would not necessarily be accepted. And the working group would be given its marching orders to go back and make revisions to the standard, taking into account the revisions that the community had proposed that everybody agreed were important. That would then go back to the planning committee, who would have a final look at it, and then it would go out to the community. That was the process for each chapter. For the first chapter that went out, which was the chapter that is not in there anymore, which is the report of the Fonds d'Archives Working Group report, because the original vision of RAD was that you would have a chapter on the Fonds d'Archives, and the working group there were people who represented all of the different media. And then each additional chapter would deal, I'm not quite sure what they thought was going to happen. I think, everything else would be at the series file and item level for all the different media. That was the original plan. And it was after the community comments came back, and I think for the first Fonds d'Archives Working Group report, there were probably 50 responses. It was a considerable response. There was a decision made to rewrite the rules and to have a general rules chapter that was even more analogous. Because the Fonds d'Archives Working Group, probably nobody here was alive when the Fonds d'Archives Working Group came out. But when it came out, it was kind of AACR2, but it wasn't really AACR2. And then it got seriously AACR2 after that went out. And it was partly because the community didn't find the structure of a phone level chapter working, partly because even though we had media specialists from machine-readable archives at the time, audiovisual and so forth, nobody saw their interest respected sufficiently in the chapter. With each subsequent chapter that was published, we received fewer and fewer responses from the community. So there was for the first 2 years or so, there was a lot of input from the community. But after that point, people from the planning committee started going out to talk about RAD and try to prepare people for RAD. And so the mechanism shifted a bit more. So it was, people knew about it more. So it was presentations at conferences and things like that.
And so I think the chapter-by-chapter revision process or consultation process carried on under CCAD with the new chapter. No, I'm saying after CCAD took over and there were a few new chapters, so it was a similar process. Although you might not have had email to take advantage of things in the first early on. I mean, I'm thinking of the trigger point in the mid-90s when they made Mosaic.
They only use Twitter?
So my follow-up question would be, do we want to do this again? But use forums, blogs, social media to ensure feedback, rétroaction, and similar stuff? I mean, is it something like that we would want to do now with the new RAD we're thinking about? Your mic is off.
The cost of RAD development included the cost of 2 full-time salaries, as well as meetings of people from around the country. I don't think that's a financial model that's viable. Certainly not the two, unless you have a different opinion, Chris, about 2 full-time project personnel devoted to the development of the standard.
We can take a look at funding sources. But I think you mentioned a good point about the 2 full-time staff. There is a cost of collaboration, and we have to be conscious of that as we move forward. There's a lot of work to be done, and our institutions do provide a significant in-kind investment, but there is that hidden cost of collaboration that we sometimes take for granted, which happens behind the scenes. That it's that iceberg, right? We're only seeing the tip, but there's the phone calls that happen, the filing, the paper, all the electronic records, all that infrastructure in behind that has to be there to support all this valuable work that the volunteers are doing. So not to be discouraging, but it is there, and we have to be conscious of that and keep that in mind as we move forward and as we build proposals and so on, and our roadmap.
Il faut aussi, je crois, we must remember les façons dont les associations communiquent avec leurs membres a changé aussi. À l'époque, je me rappelle qu'à l'AQ, nous avions des groupes locaux où on pouvait faire réagir les membres sur les chapitres. Cette structure-là n'est plus existante, donc il faut retrouver par rapport à comment les associations maintenant établissent le dialogue avec les membres.
And yes, the infrastructure has changed locally, and it's quite different from region to region to region, and we have to keep that in mind. The volunteer base from region to region to region varies dramatically, so we have to keep that in mind. We're asking a lot of the archival community in the time that they donate to all these efforts, and we're really splitting hairs. Our volunteers, you see the same people at the table. You want something done, you ask a busy person. And there's burnout. So we have to be conscious of what we're asking each of you to do.
And also one comment I'd like to make, I would like to see more use of the student population that we have, because there are a lot of great students out there who are doing a lot of great work, even though they may not be working in the archival profession. Maybe many of us who have graduated still aren't working in the archival profession. So I think making use of the student population in any way we can would also be good, because they get experience. You know, it's a win-win-win.
Might be worth building into every provincial or ACA conference or AAQ, also like a user, you know how we have a ACA user input session, like a RAD input session basically into each conference, and we kind of, you know, just chat about what's going on.
Just a quick comment that I think it's important to have a variety of this has already been said, but a variety of venues and media used for input and collaboration, because there's a significant population of practicing archivists or archival students that, for whatever reason, do not belong to any of the associations. For various reasons, and there's a lot of dialogue happening that does not filter into conferences, doesn't it doesn't circulate here, but it's circulating elsewhere, and I think that energy can be tapped and give people an opportunity, and there's lots of opinionated people who would, given the opportunity, will just go after drafts in a productive way. So
maybe one sort of question, like we've talked earlier in the morning about if we did come up with something that's more lightweight or whatever we call it, Like, I don't know that we would need that same kind of structure if we didn't have media chapters, if we didn't have 700 pages of text. If we're basically coming up with a very minimal sort of data set, it might be possible to get that kind of feedback in a less expensive way, though there's still going to be a cost for sure.
I would also say when RAD was being developed, there was nothing before it. That was really starting from scratch. This is a very different starting point here.
And also, I like the idea of having a session at the ACA conference, because many people can only get funding to go to the conference, but can't get funding to go to anything else. So that would be, I think a useful suggestion to look at, because I think you'd get a large, many archivists go to it, not everybody, but you'd get a cross-section going at least.
It's a practical way that ACA, but also other archival associations can get involved with the process, would be to schedule this kind of work. I mean, like at the AMA meeting or whatever as well, to have, time set aside specifically to discuss the development of the national standard, for example.
I was just going to add that a town hall model also, both virtual and live, falls within the mandates of both LIC and the provincial territorial archives as well. So that might be something to engage our stakeholders in supporting a broader town hall model for consultation.
Something I'm just thinking about, we've been discussing sort of how to engage the community, and it's kind of starting to occur to me that, these are all fantastic ideas and they should be all pursued in different ways, but we're also talking about possibly some of the more or less interesting aspects of archival work, and I think the response rate to the survey is a bit indicative of what we should expect at these kinds of things. We could have a member input forum at the ACA, and that's a fantastic idea, but I don't expect it to be a door break, and maybe that might change when we have something more substantial to share with the community. I don't know if people involved in the first iteration of RAD have some comment on, what the volume of feedback was. I think you said 15 responses. Did I hear that right? To the 50?
50.
Okay. In proportion to the number of archivists, that's quite small. So we're attracting people who are sort of professionally interested in this kind of work, and there are many more archivists who, are happy to use a standard, maybe less concerned about what it looks like, because their focus is on access or appraisal or other aspects of our other core functions that we're not talking about today. And I just want to point that out before we spend a lot of time and effort and money trying to do every type of consultation that we possibly can.
Those 3 people will be very engaged.
I think, though, we did get I was kind of impressed by how many people responded. Just thinking, I don't, like, Tim, you could probably speak more about this. RAD2 response rate was quite a bit lower than this, right? So, in terms of feedback, so I thought this came out in pretty short notice, pretty quick turnaround time. So I thought, at least in that respect, it was kind of encouraging.
I think also when we get nearer to the point of having to tell them, that they will have to change something in their practice, that they will have to invest hours into, although this is something we're going to address in the next session, when you start telling them, well, you'll have to start working at updating your descriptions, and when it's going to become real for them, I think the engagement level is going to go up. But at the point where we're at right now, where we're thinking more on theory and strategies and things like that, I think it doesn't reach them because it's not immediate. It's not it's not in their daily activities. So I don't know if there's a way to create a buzz about it. How do you create a buzz about description, indexing, and things like that? Like you said, the 3 archivists in the country might get interested, but I don't know if there's something else that can be done.
I think if you give people something to react to, if you give them a document for feedback, people will react. So even if as a group we decide to deliberately do something completely radical, people will respond. So maybe we push a little past our comfort zone, and the community will readjust us in the sense of maybe go 2 steps a little too far, knowing that there's our buzz, where people will be like, no, this is the parameter, be here. So
it's almost like a panic when the moment comes to actually, because that seems to be what happens. But thinking of other federal guidelines on research data management and other kinds of things that are, and this has been going on for years, and it only matters, this year when it's a requirement of the application, and so it's a good point, Francois, about being prepared for a high level of engagement towards the end of the process, but perhaps less so when we're still trying to find our way.
Well, I mean, as Richard said, I thought the response to the survey was quite impressive in terms of numbers. But part of it is also about having the opportunity along the way. And I mean, we could, if you waited until there was something bigger, then the blowback is, why are we only hearing about this now?
So just to clarify, I would advocate a gentle panic. I don't want to make anyone lose their lunch or anything, but yeah.
Okay.
And also just speaking on behalf of ACA members, definitely more information, even though people may do nothing about it, that's their end of things. But I think they want more information versus less. Or just to be kept in the loop about what's going on.
Yeah, more information in terms of more frequent updates, opposite to longer reports and pages to read. Because I think if it goes beyond a few pages, I think we might lose a few of our colleagues and lose their interest.
I was just going to say, somebody can volunteer to write something for the notes and communications section of Archivaria about this meeting.
There was a significant part of A78 devoted to notes and communications to cover the Archive Summit, and the same thing could be done for this. That's the one sheet.
Two consultative processes that I think were very successful are the ones around OAIS, and then this is maybe a bit of a grandiose comparison, but the development of the internet standards using requests for communication. And both of these models basically relied on a core group that was doing the work but keeping the process open so that there was a flow of information and people could check in as they wanted, and the external communications are always welcome. The challenge with that kind of a process is that it requires a core funding base, which in the case of the Internet protocols was provided by the American government, and in the case of OAIS was provided by the Consultative Committee for Space Data. So without having that kind of a robust funding base, I don't know. I think it's really challenging to create this kind of a protracted consultation in which the standard continues to move forward and people can check in as necessary. So I don't know. I guess my point is just to look at other models as well that have been successful.
Great. So before we head to our last break, just to go back on what was discussed, of course, we talked a lot about users and you need to know what they want, even if some of them might actually not know what they want, but also not to lose too much time because it's such a wide-ranging population that it would be hard to pin down exactly what their requirements are because they are very complex. But also we highlighted the need to consult creators of records, which can be very informative for us in our work. Media specialists, people from the audiovisual and sound archives was given as an example, and it's true that they really have a specialization which could be a good reference for us. Also involve students more, which could be another option to have them on board to help us along the way. And also that, contrary to the experiment with RAD, which was kind of a complex standard, feedback now would be a bit easier to have since the standard we will be working on might be quite simpler. And we finished by talking about trying how to figure out how to engage members of our community, trying to have a level of interest, and also all to maintain the communication lines and maintain the information going and flowing, and not lose the interest of our colleagues. So that's it.